Well, it's so good to see you all, or sort of see you all in the shadows today. So thank you so much for having me. As Brendan mentioned, my name is Dr. Carl Tony. I'm a professor at Hope International University, one of your sister schools. I just want to say hello from California. Thank you for your hospitality. I've really enjoyed my time here. I'm looking forward to the rest of my day here with you all, and it's just really a privilege and an honor to be with you. I'm also very excited. My degree, I'm a New Testament professor, and so I want to thank you and thank Brandon for the opportunity to be able to speak to you out of my area of expertise, the Hebrew Bible, so that I can rub this into my friends who are Old Testament professors' faces when I get back to school, just to let them know the truth of Scripture. So just thank you so much for that. To show my biblical literacy, I'd like you to turn in your Bibles to the book that you've been studying so far, to the book of Naomi. We're looking at Naomi chapter 4 today. So just go ahead and flip to your scriptures. It goes Joshua, Judges, Naomi, 1st and 2nd Samuel. Right? Our Bibles don't say that. They call it the book of Ruth. But now that you're at the end of your series, I'm here to tell you that the book of Ruth, I think, would be better named the book of Naomi. I think that the main character of the book is Naomi. See, Ruth is certainly the hero of the story. She comes in and saves the day, but Naomi is the Israelite who needs to be saved. And when you look at the beginning of the story and you think about who this story was written to, it's written to the Israelite people, isn't it? And Naomi is the Israelite in the story. Ruth is the Moabite. And over, in the book of Naomi, you were told that Ruth is the Moabite. She's the outsider. She's the foreigner. Even at the beginning of the story, Naomi tries to push her daughter-in-law away. She tries to send her back to her homeland, to her home gods. And yet, she persists. Ruth sticks with Naomi and stays with her. And you hear the story of progress. And what's really interesting when you get to chapter 4 is you discover that at the beginning of the book, that Naomi becomes childless. Her children die. But by the end of the book, Ruth has a baby, but at the very end of the book, the author identifies that baby almost like it's Naomi's baby, and Ruth kind of disappears from the scene at the end of the story. And so I just want to invite you to think about this story with fresh eyes, to think about the story from the perspective of Naomi, and maybe to consider this the book of Naomi. Why I like that is if we understand that Ruth is the hero, we all want to be Ruths in many ways. We all like to be heroes. And I'm at a Bible college, and so I think I'm in a room full of heroes, or people that want to be heroes, or heroines. And the great thing with a hero story is heroes' stories, we don't like this part, but they usually start off with some sort of tragedy, don't they? Right? So we get this in Batman, mom and dad die. You get Superman, mom and dad die, planet blows up. Maybe the dog is left over and comes eventually back to the planet, but everyone dies. My kids, they're all under 10, and we've gone to see various Disney movies over the time. One of my children gets so traumatized, I have to show up late to almost every Disney movie because every good Disney movie starts with something awful happening to the main character, right? So Elsa and Anna's mom and dad, they disappear on a shipwreck. You get Nemo's mom dying. You just go all over the place. They always start with some sort of horrific tragedy, don't they? We don't like to think about that part of the hero journey, the hero arc. But even in the book of Naomi, it starts off with tragedy, doesn't it? You see Ruth's husbands die. You see Naomi's husband dies. You see both of the sons of Naomi die. The beginning of the story is a story of tragedy. It's a story of loss. Naomi is someone who needs to be saved. And while we all want to be heroes, we all want to be the Ruths of the story, I think that the biblical author has invited us to consider what it's like to be the Naomis. And today I want to talk to you about what it means to be people that need to be rescued. And what does it mean to be rescued? And maybe rescued by someone who you don't expect to be rescued by. This is the Moabite, the outsider, the foreigner. Ruth, as a Moabite, doesn't have the best reputation. Her origin story involves Lot and his daughters after they flee from Sodom and Gomorrah. What happens? They're in a cave. The daughters decide that they want to make sure that their lineage keeps going, so they get dad drunk and they sleep with him. And that produces two children. One of the children is supposedly the heir of the nation of Moab. Things don't start off very well for the Moabites. Then you get further in the biblical story and you discover that when the children of Israel leave Egypt, as they're journeying across the land, they encounter the Moabites who are fearful of the Israelites, and they hire Balaam, the man with the talking donkey, to come and curse the Israelites. Balaam goes to try to curse the Israelites 3 times, and 3 times he can't curse them, he has to bless them. So even though he wants to get his payday for cursing them, he's not able to. Now, I know a lot of our flannel graph stories of the story of Balaam and the donkey, we see him as this kind of good guy. But if you actually read Numbers 21 to 24, you discover Balaam's not a good guy. He's a false prophet. He is a bad teacher, and he does a lot of things to lead Israel astray. In fact, with the Moabites, after he's not successful with cursing Israel 3 times, he advises the king of Moab. He says, look, I can't curse them. God's not letting me. But here's what you do. Intermarry with the Israelite people. Teach them about your gods and start to include them in your culture and your identity. You can assimilate the Israelites, and if you do that, they won't be your enemies. You will actually have control over them. And so in the stories of Numbers 21 to 24, we discovered that's exactly what they tried to do, is they tried to assimilate the Israelites. And God sends a plague against the Israelites. There's a wonderful, colorful story of this priest Phinehas, who, in response to the Moabites and the Midianites trying to invest themselves in the Israelites' lives, he runs into a tent and spears an Israelite and a Midianite, apparently while they're in the middle of intercourse, and kills them. And he's praised for this, and it causes God to stop his plague against the Israelites. That's the Moabites. The Moabites, for this very story, twice in the Old Testament, both in Deuteronomy and in the book of Numbers, they're told, don't ever marry a Moabite. Don't include them in the assembly of the people. This people is a cursed people because when you were in the desert, they weren't friendly to you. They brought God's curse against you. Stay away from the Moabites. They are not people that should be part of your family. That's Ruth, the Moabite. That's where the story of Naomi begins as she flees Israel and goes into the land of Moab, this land where people were originally the ones that tried to curse the Israelites. That's who she is. And yet, that very heroine, Ruth, the Moabite, is going to become the hero of the story. This story might remind you of a story of Jesus. After all, the New Testament scholars have to bring Jesus in here somewhere. Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan, right? Think about that story. You get the priest, the Levite. These are like supposed to be the most godly people in the land. And when they see someone who is injured on the side of the road, they move to the other side and don't help that person. But the one person that helps the injured man is who? The Samaritan, the outsider, the foreigner, the guy who worships the wrong gods. And it's the Samaritan that's the hero of the story. It's the Samaritan that Jesus says, if you want to know how to love, don't look to your religious leaders, look to the Samaritan. In a modern day context, you might say, if Jesus was saying this, he might say, don't look to your pastor, don't look to your Bible professor. If they see someone on the side of the road, they pass that person by. But did you see that Muslim person over there? They're the ones that took care of the hurt man. Christian church, if you want to know how to love, be like a Muslim. That's the sort of context, that's the sort of power of the parable of the Good Samaritan that we miss. That as Christians, we don't have exclusive claims of what it means to love, but that we actually can learn from the world about what it means to properly love our neighbor. It doesn't mean that that Muslim or that Samaritan had their right relationship with God. They had to still get that sorted out. But that's part of the opportunity we have, is that if we go and learn from other people, even things as simple as love, from the Samaritan, from the Moabite, if we enter into partnerships with them, as they teach us about love of people, we have this incredible opportunity to teach people about the love of God for them and to truly transform and change the world. Ruth, as the Moabite, as the foreigner, as the person who worships the false gods, comes alongside of Naomi and enters into relationship with her and her family. And by the end of the story, we see Ruth has become part of God's covenant people. in her willingness to love her neighbor, in her willingness to save her mother-in-law, she ends up being saved herself. I don't think it's a bad thing for us that we have to always be the heroes. We think that we are God's gift to humanity, don't we? When I was in Bible college, I was a Bible major, and when I got done with Bible college, I felt called to be a missionary in Swaziland. And so I went to Swaziland, and I felt like I was being called as a Bible major because I was God's gift to the Swazis. When I got there, my first job was to get a telephone for our mission organization. And I went into the office and tried to get it. I thought that was a simple thing, get a telephone hooked up. It took me 8 weeks. I'd go in, the person would say, well, if not today, tomorrow for sure. Go in, if not today, tomorrow for sure, with such confidence. If not today, tomorrow for sure. Next time your professors ask for a paper that was due on time, feel free to say to them, if not today, tomorrow for sure. See how that was. Say, I learned it in chapel. It's got to be good. It's got to be true. Blame me. I'm just the guest speaker. 2 months out of my 6-month time in Swaziland, I felt like God was wasting my time, wasting really his time, getting a telephone. Wasn't I trained to teach people the Bible? Wasn't I trained to be a great youth leader? Wasn't I trained to evangelize people? Wasn't I God's gift to the Swazi people? Isn't that why God sent me there? But instead, I felt wasted for those couple months. Sometimes in Christian ministry, we feel like we have to be effective in everything we do. Sometimes we feel like we are the heroes of the world. Sometimes we feel like we're supposed to be the Ruths of the story. But I find it fascinating that this story is a story about Naomi and God using Ruth to save Naomi. I want to encourage you today, encourage you the rest of the semester, even as we enter into the Christmas season. Think about the areas in your life that you need saving from. Think about the places that you need God to rescue you. I loved the worship songs that we're singing and the songs about being rescued from the waters. We cry out in our songs and our music about these sort of things all the time. And yet we also get into this confident mindset that we're supposed to be the saviors of other people. And we forget there's only one Savior, and that's Jesus. Naomi had a lot of things to be saved from. And if you look in Naomi chapter 1, we get a whole list of things that she needed to be saved from. As an Israelite, she stood within the promises of Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, 15, 17, where God says to Abraham, look, you're an Israelite, I'm going to make you a great nation, I'm going to give you this land, and you're going to be a blessing to the whole world. And yet, when you look at the opening in Naomi chapter 1, you discover all of those promises, God seems to have failed Naomi in severe ways. Right? So, the land promise. Naomi chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. A certain man in Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab. The land failed them. They had to flee their land. There was no more food in their country. The promise of God that you would have land, they have to give up on that promise. Then you go further in the story and you discover the promise of having a family. That for Naomi, God failed in this promise as well. Her husband, Elimelech, dies. To make things worse, her 2 sons die. All she's left, she's a widow, and she's left with widows. You think about the idea that God's people are supposed to be a blessing to other nations, to other people. How do you think Orpah, I always want to say Oprah instead of Orpah. Anyone else will do that with this name? Orpah and Ruth, they were supposed to be blessed by the Israelite people. They were supposed to be blessed by Naomi's family. And yet, their husbands die. It's not much of a blessing of God's people for these foreign women. Naomi recognizes that, and she decides that she's going to go back. She gets a glimmer that maybe things are going to change, and we see in verse 6, she heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered his people and given them food again. So she thought, well, maybe I should go back home. But it's not all positive. Verse 12, she tells her daughter-in-laws, daughters, go your way. I'm too old to have a husband. even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they're grown? Would you refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it's been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me. Have you ever felt like the promises of God? Have you ever felt like God has turned against you? Have you ever felt like you were doing the very thing that God wanted you to do, and you were feeling ruined in that moment? In those first 2 months of Swaziland, I felt like I was doing the right thing. I believed this idea that if I sacrificed myself on God's altar, that He would make me alive and make me new and give me the strength. His strength was sufficient for me. And yet I found I was weak and broken. For Naomi, she was more bitter. Felt the hand of the Lord was against her. She goes on to say, verse 20, call me no longer Naomi, but call me Mara, which means bitter. For the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? Bible characters aren't supposed to say these sort of things. They're supposed to be confident in God and believe in His blessings and promises. They're not supposed to call God out and say, God, I felt like you promised me these things and you failed me in this way and in this way and in this way, and I'm disappointed. If you haven't experienced this moment yet in your life, don't worry, it's coming. You're going to get disappointed by God. You're going to get disappointed by other people. You're going to have points of brokenness. It happens. It's called life. And what I love about this story of Naomi is that's how the story opens. She's a woman who feels broken, not just by the people around her, but by the God of the universe. She feels like God has failed her and broken His promises to her. And that's where the story starts off. She is someone who needs a hero. And Ruth is going to step up. And as you guys have journeyed through the book of Naomi, you've seen the ways that Ruth has stepped up and been the hero. First, she starts to glean in the fields of Boaz, right, in chapter 2, and she begins to provide for Naomi as she's going into the fields. And then in chapter 3, you discover that Naomi is helping Ruth to figure out a way to get a marriage proposal out of Boaz to help secure Ruth's future. But Ruth isn't content simply to secure her own future. Even the beginning of the story starts off with the say that Ruth was young and beautiful and capable enough that she could have gotten another husband, but she decides to stay with Naomi because she's invested, she's loyal to her family. The scene from chapter 3 with Ruth and Boaz it's almost a scene of Ruth could have been content with simply marrying Boaz and been done with it. But she has something that she prizes more than her own marriage, and that's her own loyalty to her family, her loyalty to her mother-in-law, and she does things to help secure not only her future, but the future of her mother-in-law and the future of her extended family, which is where we pick things up in chapter 4, where we discover that Boaz, because of his love for Ruth, has come up with a scheme in order to get not only Ruth's hand in marriage, but also to get the land of Naomi back and to secure her land and her future and to secure for her a future. All it took was 10 men and 1 shoe. And that's what we see at the beginning of chapter 4. No sooner had Boaz gone to the city gate and sat down than the next of kin whom Boaz had spoken came passing by. And he says, "Come over, friend." Our Bible here says friend. One commentator looks at the Hebrew here, and I love the translation. I think it's better. It says, so-and-so is the best way to translate this Hebrew phrase. Come over here, so-and-so. At the beginning of Ruth, you have Orpah and Ruth identified. Ruth's the one who's faithful and sticks with Naomi, and so she's named and identified, but also Orpah's named, and she goes back her own way. Ruth's the faithful one. You have a parallel in chapter 4 where Boaz is going to be the faithful one, but this other person isn't named. Not only that, it's not just friend, it was so-and-so. This person, their name was scratched out of the annals of history because his refusal to help out his family. On the other hand, we know about Boaz. So Boaz says, "Come over here, so-and-so, sit down." And he came over and sat down. And Boaz took 10 men, the elders of the city, and said, "Sit down here next to me." It says, "Naomi who's come back from land Moab, is selling a parcel of land. So-and-so says, oh, fantastic, land? I like that. This is the first time you hear about land. We didn't know that Naomi had land at the beginning of the book. This is the first time you discover that there's more to this story than simply the future of Ruth's hand in marriage. There's land involved. So-and-so, when he's offered the land by Boaz, says, is anyone willing to redeem it? And of course, so-and-so says, yes, I will redeem it. Then verse 5, Boaz says, well, by the way, the day you acquire the field in the hand of Naomi, you're also acquiring Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead man, to maintain the dead man's name and his inheritance. Suddenly, so-and-so says, whoa, hold on. I was interested in that land because it seemed like a good investment, but now you're telling me I have to pay money for this land, and I'm going to have to give that land away when she has a kid? That doesn't seem like a smart investment on my behalf, does it? I pay money, I'm expecting that it's going to stay in my land, it's going to stay in my family, and all of a sudden you say that there is another family whose interest is attached to this, and I'm going to be putting my money out for someone else's benefit. Yeah, on second thought, you go ahead. Like, I'll back out. Thank you, but no thank you. On top of that, not only is there a financial issue here, but there's also a racial issue here. Deuteronomy says, don't marry a Moabite. It's part of the law. This guy's probably thinking, ooh, Ruth the Moabite. Not just Ruth the Moabite. Well, the Bible does tell me not to marry Moabites, so I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to put myself at risk of intermarrying with this foreigner. And so not only is this person not willing to put a financial risk, but he's also not willing to put a spiritual risk out there to marry the foreigner, the Moabite. Now, Boaz has a different perspective on this. When we look at the Gospel of Matthew, we discover that Boaz's dad is Salmon, and his mom is none other than Rahab, the prostitute, the one that saved the spies in Jericho. That's Boaz's mom, a Canaanite. And it's quite possible, can you imagine Boaz growing up in this home of half Canaanite, half Israelite? What does that mixed home look like? What does his appreciation of the Canaanite people and culture look like as he's also part of the Israelite people and culture? As he's called and serves loyalty to Israel's God because that's what his parents have taught him, but he also recognizes that Israel's God was not an exclusive God. Sure, if you stood against Israel's God, then you were the enemies of Israel. But if you were willing to come alongside of Israel's God, if you were willing to declare allegiance to him, then you were invited to join God's covenant people. And Boaz knew that. He saw that. He saw that with his mom. And here Ruth the Moabite comes along. And he sees this woman that is willing to maintain loyalty to Yahweh and Yahweh's people. And so he's willing to take a risk to invite her, to include her as part of the people of God. He was taught that by his parents, and he lived it out in his own life. And so this man, this so-and-so says, no thank you, I'm not going to deal with that foreign woman problem. No thank you, I'm not going to put myself at financial risk for somebody else's benefit. I only secure my own family's financial future. You go ahead and take it. And so what does he do? All right, the weird thing in the Bible, takes off his shoe. There you go. I'm out. A weird thing, right? There's a lot of speculation in terms of what's going on with this shoe. When you look at shoes in the Bible, often what happens is we see when people approach God, think about Moses, when he approaches God before the burning bush, he takes his shoes off to be in the presence of the holy God, doesn't he? Does it make you nervous if I stand up here with one shoe untied? See if I can trip. I'm going to tie this while I talk, see if I can do two things at once. Before entering the presence of God, Moses takes off his shoes. Entering the holy presence of God, you take things off. There's this idea that when we take shoes off, that we divest ourselves of the places we've walked. We divest ourselves of of the space that we were in before. And probably the idea behind why he would take this shoe off and give that to Boaz is he's saying, look, just as I'm taking my sandal off now and giving it to you so that you can have claim to land, I promise these shoes will never walk on that land because it is not my land to own. Only people with ownership have rights to walk on that land, or people that they've invited to walk on that land. So here's my shoe. I'm divesting myself of my rights to the land. You can have it. And so he gives Boaz the shoe. And Boaz takes it, and of course, he has the land, he gets the girl, but that's not the end of the story. We discover that Ruth becomes pregnant, and that she has a child, and that she hands this child off to Naomi. And we get these interesting things. Naomi chapter 4, verse 17. The woman of the neighborhood, they gave this child a name. They name him Obed. And they say, a son has been born to Ruth? No, that's not what the Bible says. A son has been born to Naomi. The ending of the book of Naomi does not focus on Ruth's son, but says that the son that Ruth is born is a child of Naomi. I think this gets back to the echoes of the first chapter where we discover that God had made promises to Naomi and to the Israelite people. You'll have a great family, you'll have land, and you'll be a blessing to other people. And we see through the actions of Ruth, the Moabite, the foreigner, the stranger, that Naomi's life has been saved, that her family's been saved. Ruth has provided a son for Naomi. Her legacy is going to continue. Through Ruth's actions, Naomi's land has been restored back to her, and she has a place and a home. We also discover through Ruth's actions that Naomi is once again a blessing to all nations. And we see that at the end because we discover, surprise, surprise, that Ruth and Naomi's lineage is not just a normal Israelite's lineage, but we discover, verse 21, the end of the book, Salmon was the father of Boaz, Boaz of Obed, and Obed of Jesse, and Jesse of David. That we've been hearing the story of the Israelite king, the forerunner of the Messiah. And that part of David's lineage, part of his DNA, is the DNA that includes not only good Israelite blood, but also questionable blood of the Moabites. That God uses David's lineage to reconcile people groups that from the time when the children of Israel tried to enter into the land of the promise and they tried to prevent that and they tried to bring curses down upon Israel for their actions, God uses Boaz and Ruth as a point of reconciliation between these races in the household of the leader of Israel. And we see that through the actions of Ruth and Boaz. We discover that Ruth has truly come and saved Naomi and her family and offered a vision for what it means for other people to be saved. I encourage you, as you think about the ways that maybe God has disappointed you, rather than trying to save yourself, ask God to bring people into your life to rescue you. And look for unusual ways that God might rescue. Look for people that are unexpected. And to look for the ways that God can use people that you wouldn't expect to rescue you, to bring encouragement to you. And to remember the story of Naomi, that while there's periods of our life where it may seem like God does not make good on his promises, that at the end of the day, we serve a trustworthy God who we can trust and have faith in because God always makes good on his promises. Even if it's not in the way that we expect, even if it's not in the timing we expect, God will make good on his promises. That's the fundamentals of what faith is about. We have a trustworthy God who we can trust in. And we need to be telling stories of trust so that we're ready in those times of crisis to continue to trust in him so that we see the story to the end, or we discover how God has been faithful to keep his promises and to rescue us in our times of need. As I close, I want to leave you with a quote that I found from a scholar that I found very poignant. The form of the story encourages us to see not just that we ought to be like Ruth, but that we are like Naomi. The form of the story encourages us to see not just that we ought to be like Ruth, but that we are like Naomi. I know we all want to be like Ruth. She's the hero. But we all are like Naomi. And if we can embrace that, we can understand that we are Naomi's in need of rescue. And the good news is God is sending Ruth into our lives to rescue us.